Since its publication in 2023, Sand Roses has made quite a journey from the hometown of its author, Hamza Koudri in Algiers, to South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, and the UK. If you've been following this journey, you will be aware already that Sand Roses was one of the runners-up of the Island Prize of 2022. We caught up with Hamza on life since the Island Prize, on writing historical fiction, book tours, the author's life, and some of his favourite reads of the last year.
Sand Roses finally came out in November 2023, and I think before that there was a lot of attention from the media here. An Algerian book written in English, there was a lot of excitement for it. The youth were really curious to see what kind of book this is. I got the chance to speak at a few events, including there was the EU Algerian sort of meetup of writers, and so I was able to interact with some writers from Algeria, writers from Europe around the event here, which was really nice. And this was before it even came out. Then it came out during what we call SILA, which is the International Book Fair of Algiers, which is one of the biggest, probably the biggest event in the country. It attracts millions of visitors. It's really huge in terms of reach. And again, there was a lot of excitement. I think there was a publisher here, Daliman, who I think she took a chance to say, okay, let's try this, a book written in English. Let's try this and see how it works. We'll just print a limited number of copies, and lo and behold, it actually sold out immediately sort of during the fair, before even the end. And I think sort of that was proof that there is interest for English here. There was interest for sort of fresh voices that are telling different parts of our history. I was invited to speak a lot on interviews, and then on also at events around the country, at bookstores and everything. And after that, I started to interact with these youth, and it started to prove a little bit of a point in a way that you'd think, the youth are not reading anymore, or youth, there's no interest for English. But no, actually, I think, even people on social media, there are a lot of, creators, content creators who publish around books in general. And, they would be reading the book in English, just like they would do another one in French. For example, we had Sabrine, we had quite a few other people there was Nelia too, who would read the book, and so she put these beautiful posters. So it was really a good chance to get to interact with a lot of these readers. And a lot of them were actually surprised to learn about a part of our history that we don't really know about. The Red Nail dancers, it has gone sort of a little bit into oblivion. A lot of people came up and said, well, I'm learning now so much about our own history. Oh, this gave me a chance to also interact with my grandmother and ask her questions about our history and our town, which was really nice. I was at one point, this was really nice, when I was invited to a school event where some kids sort of, they acted one little scene from the book, which was really nice, sort of seeing Fahima and Salima come to life. It gave me goosebumps to see that. And then I think, it just kept going better and better in so many ways.
Life has been busy since Sand Roses hit the bookshops, with interviews on radio, TV, attending book fairs and book signing events, and in between all this, Hamza managed to fit in an intensive book tour of 3 countries in 1 month.
Yeah, it was super intensive, and it all happened within the span of 3 weeks, I think. And we're talking super long flights. People underestimate how far Algiers is from Cape Town, and then sadly, because it's not the most connected continent, its challenge is getting better, but then it was difficult to fly directly, so you had to sort of connect, and then you end up spending time on this 10-hour flights with long layovers. But it's a first world problem. I can't complain about that. I still got the chance to cross the continent, and really I had a great time in Cape Town. I think Robert was joking. It was like, I hope you get some chapters done on the flight. I was like, not while I was sleeping, no. There were these festivals. I was invited to Open Book Festival in South Africa, and then Macondo Festival in Kenya, and those were both fantastic events that brought together a lot of fantastic writers. I got the chance to meet Karen Jennings finally. So Karen Jennings has been really big supporter for for the entire period. I got to meet her for the first time in Cape Town. But then too, I think it gave me the chance to interact with audiences that are not typically familiar with Algerian literature, Algerian stories. So a lot of them would say, "Hey, this is my first time meeting a writer from Algeria," or "We didn't know there was English in Algeria." And some people don't even make sort of the difference between Algeria and other neighboring countries. And I don't blame them, because I don't think there's a lot of interaction. It's changing now, and I think this is one way where we're building more connections with the rest of the continent. And then in Kenya too, there's this really nice community built around the Macondo Festival. And then I got to meet with writers from all over Africa, but also beyond, made some really great friends. But yet again, there was all of these people who had never heard about the story coming out of Algeria. Because typically, we publish in Arabic and French, and a lot of the titles are actually translated into other languages. But we tend to sort of have this interaction mostly sort of within the Arab world, in Arabic or in French, with France and other French-speaking countries, especially in Africa. But this was my chance to interact with new audiences. And then finally, around that, it was all in the same month, I was also at the DZ Fest, which is Algerian Festival in London, that brings in all different forms of art, from music and film and theater. And I was there on the evening where we did literature. And it was also very nice to interact with the Algerian diaspora in the UK, all very thirsty to learn a little bit about Algerian history, to interact with somebody who writes in English. There are also some other foreigners who are interested in the Algerian culture. So I think it all sort of worked out, and again, I'm very grateful for how the Island Prize and the community around it and all the support that I got helped me get to this point. And I'm very grateful to everybody who's showed interest in this.
The Island Prize was co-founded by Karen Jennings and Holland House Books, and the reason it came into being was because
the Island Prize is not about money or prestige. The Island Prize is really about creating a system where African writers are recognized not only within the continent and their own countries, but also around the globe. So the purpose of the prize is more of a mentorship or a helping hand to try and support writers to navigate the very, very difficult and oftentimes confusing and unfriendly process of trying to find an agent or a publisher.
I think, this is also sort of how the Island Prize has helped me and other writers sort of find a platform for their voices and tell our stories and get our books out there to traditional audiences, but also new audiences that we wouldn't probably have had a chance to reach. And since then, I've been sort of a big promoter of the Island Prize. Whenever I meet young writers or people who are trying to get published, I always say, "Oh, have you had a chance to check out the Island Prize? Have you seen the opportunity? Are you able to apply?" Because too, I think what I'm seeing here is there is this, and this is I think an important point, because a lot of writers who want to get published, I think because of lack of guidance and I think lack of opportunities in general, they seem to think the only way to get published is through self-publishing. And I think, there's things to say about that. It may work for some people, but what I end up having a lot of time is a young writer would come up to me and say, "Oh, it's fantastic you're able to get your book published. I've written a book, but it's very expensive to get it published." And what do you mean it's expensive? Because they think the only way to get published is if you actually pay for the service. And I think that's something fundamentally wrong. And I always make sure to say, no. I mean, if you know all the options and that's what you choose, it's fine. But you need to know, self-publishing isn't the only way to do it. You're not supposed to be paying for this. There's other ways sort of, to get published. And then actually, I try to send them to some of these opportunities, including the Island Prize. But I think there's a lot of work to be done there in terms of sort of mentorship and sharing sort of the tips and best practices and, sharing opportunities like this.
After joining the Island Prize family, Hamza also joined the panel of judges for the 2023 session, which gave him the chance to discover more up-and-coming storytellers.
I don't think we sort of struggled to choose the winner, A Mouthful of Salt, and Reem Ghaffar was brilliant because I think too is, I am a big fan of historical fiction in general, but this was very unique because it was telling us a story about a part of the world that we know very little about. She comes with this story from a small village on the Nile, in the Sudanese part of the Nile, so it's in Sudan. It's a part of the world that I personally didn't know much about, but then she manages to create this cast of characters that are very sort of realistic, and I think anybody would recognize them as, as an uncle or an aunt or a neighbor or a friend, but also everybody has their own agenda, everybody has their own struggles, and you can see how you can sort of live with these people as they live in with a little bit of a community tragedy. Somebody has drowned in the river and they're trying to find him. So there's that sort of tick-tock, the race against time. But then we'll discover so much about the secrets of the village and how, there's good people, there's bad people, there's people who do both good and terrible things. And then there is this little girl who, who's making decisions about her studies, about marriage, about sort of this romance. And I think there's an element of, not magic, but then it turns out that this is part of a string of events that are they're very weird in a way that makes people believe there's some kind of magic going on. So there's that superstitious element to it. I think that there's one point there was a fire, there was one point when there was, I think, a disease or some kind of virus killing the camels. And so it puts people on edge, and I think it starts to reveal, I think this whole tragedy and the superstition, they start to reveal some dark secrets about some of these characters and what they've done in the past. I think at a human level, it's very brilliant because I think it's captivating in a way that's you are engrossed in this completely isolated world. And then at the heart of it, there is glimpses of hope as a character is, she's going through her own little romance. She's thinking of life decisions around school, around marriage, and she's learning about her own family and some of the bad things they've done. And I think, the whole thing I thought was very captivating. There was no way you could stop reading that kind of story. So it was really good sort of to read that as part of other entries. And then we've seen Reem, I think, go out to the world and really make a huge success. And her book was one of, I think, 60 most notable books in Africa. She's made it also on lists in Canada. I think it's coming to Canada. It's been translated into other countries. So it's doing very, very well. And I'm not surprised. I think we only expect this kind of success for that kind of amazing story.
A Mouthful of Salt is set between the 1950s and the 1980s and is one of Hamza's top favourite reads of 2024. Another historical fiction novel from his list was Lamentation by C.J. Sansom, who sadly passed away last year.
Both my favorite books or writers are often Ken Follett and C.J. Sansom because I love historical fiction and I think they write brilliant books. One that I particularly appreciated last year was Lamentation, which I think was book 7 in the Shard Lake series. And that's just a masterful piece of historical fiction, honestly. It's usually investigative fiction, so there's always a murder somewhere. And then you have this lawyer who's always recruited by somebody really high up to investigate some murder, because this is the 1500s, this is the Tudor era where you don't have a formal sort of investigator, but so the lawyer is your closest person who could do an investigation. So they get him to go investigate the murder, and all in each of those books, the murder turns out to be somehow related to some high impact event. And so in Lamentation, it's linked with the Queen herself. This is Queen Catherine Parr. And so, this is a time when London is going through sort of this upheaval around religious reforms. And then there's the old religion, there's new religion. And so Catherine Parr writes these confessions and they don't quite align with the king views. And the king is a big fan of hers. If her confessions get discovered, then she's in big trouble. She might get beheaded like a lot of the queens before her. So it's really high stakes that we're talking about. And so Matthew Shardlake steps in and he goes to investigate the murder. And, in each of those stories, you have these fantastic characters and he does a really good job of mixing between, you don't only, because it's not just the high life of the castle and the princes and the balls and the gowns. There's much less of that and much more of the common life. He describes the beggars and the people on the streets and the poor people, and he goes into the houses of everyone. And he's a lawyer, so he knows so much about sort of the proceedings. To me, it's a very engaging and captivating account where you can really, I think it really brings back life in London, sort of like, almost in full motion, in a way that you're walking through the streets, you're taking the boat through the river, and it's a thriller. Honestly, it's a page turner because every once in a while there's something going on. He always finds himself in big trouble, and it's good. So I love this kind of fiction, and I think what they do, both him and Ken Follett, they're amazing at sort of not just recreating this world, but they tell it from a human point of view, from a community point of view. So you see how those, the wars and the political changes, how they have an impact on everyday life, and how the common people sort of, go through it, how they suffer and they live and they survive. And I think that's what makes it fascinating, because I think that's sort of the impact of, that's the difference between a history book and historical fiction, is you get to live with the people, you get to have a human experience and connect with the stories at a personal level, and I love that.
It's another kind of time travel, isn't it?
Yeah, time and space, because you get to step into this whole world that you probably wouldn't have a chance to sort of relive, and you meet these people, you see these places how they used to be in at a time that's completely, time and space is completely different from what we're used to now and here.
So if you had the opportunity, would you travel back to this time, or do you have another time period you'd go and visit?
I mean, sort of like, I'm pretty comfortable with modern day comforts, and I think our history is pretty violent history in general. So I would hate to be stuck in some kind of war, and not that it's much safer nowadays, but.
No, but you could end up in these very pastoral surroundings where nothing happens forever and ever.
Yeah, I don't know. If I have a good book, I think I'll be fine to keep me company. No, but I mean, that's a period that I'm also very interested in, because, I love writing historical fiction. And so I've always been tempted sort of to explore, a part of the Algerian history that's also very little known, especially, in literature in general. So we write a lot about the colonial history, since the 60s to here. But very few people sort of go further than that, just because I think, there's little record of what happened in the 15, 16, all the way to the 1800s. And it's a fascinating time too, because, it was a time where the Corsairs used to rule the Mediterranean. There was so much going on at the political level. I read about these years where sort of the day, or the ruler of Algiers was changed at least 6 or 7 times in a very short span of time. I think it was 2 years or 3 years, and that's because there was a lot of revolts against the ruler, and they would change him every few months, sometimes few days or weeks. And I thought that would make for very exciting sort of like historical fiction to go back and explore again life in Algiers back then, and the Corsairs and the political upheavals. And that's part of our period that's not very much discussed. I think there's a change recently. People go back to that and explore it. Sometimes it's told from different points of view. I've seen some historical fiction written from, some Dutch writer who found some account, or French or the German. But I think it's important to go back from our point of view and sort of tell that story from our perspective.
From stories of the past to stories of the near future, next on Hamza's list was Crooked Seeds by Karen Jennings, longlisted this year for the Women's Prize for Fiction.
Yeah, I have to say, and of course I am a biased reviewer there, but for good reason. I really, really enjoyed reading Crooked Seeds, because I think Karen Jennings does an amazing job creating this formidable character who, to me, I think, it's fascinating to sort of go through this experience. It's a pretty short book, but you get to connect with this character who strikes you from the beginning as a character you would hate. If you see her on the street, or somebody in your neighborhood, you probably want to have nothing to do with her. Deidre, she does all the wrong things, and she's despicable. She's rude to people. She cheats the system whenever she can, and she's not somebody you'd want to have as a friend. And then you actually find out a little bit more that she's a little bit sort of like, she's got a bit of a history doing a lot of these terrible things. But at the same time, And sort of like as sort of time grows, you find out that there's a lot of complexity to her. She's suffered a lot. She's been dealt a very bad hand, as the saying goes. And this is time also, and that's what I find fascinating too. Is she lives, I think it's in the near future, where climate change has started to have some really bad consequences, and you see this in subtle ways in terms of like how she lines up for the water to just get the water, or how it's difficult for her to even sort of have a proper shower because the water is so scarce, and there's these fires that make in the background at one point. The other thing too about it is, as the pages go on, not only do you connect with the character, but then you start to sympathize with her, because you see how much she suffers around these circumstances. You see how her past has been riddled with all of these issues, and with her family, with her with her own brother. At one point, she's in an accident and she loses her leg. I don't want to spoil too much of the book. I want people to still be able to read it, but you can't help connecting with her at a personal level, and even if you don't agree with what she does, she sort of she gets you sort of to maybe sort of explain how she's become what she's become. You see her interact with other people and with her mother, and how she's at one point sort of she has a daughter she talks to, and so it makes her very human. And I think Karen does an amazing job sort of creating these layers of complexity to this character. And whenever you get too comfortable liking her, she would remind you that nope, this is a despicable person. we're not supposed to love her. don't start rooting for her quite yet. But through that too, I think we're also discovering layers of society, and almost like the worst part of humankind in a way. But then there's glimmers of hope and kindness, and there's people around her who, there's her neighbor who would still help her despite her being in a very difficult situation, being very poor, despite all the terrible things that Deidre does. Her neighbor would still be there for her, and I think that's a really good sort of like glimmer of hope from humankind. The book also reveals a lot about, I think, South African history, some of the darkest parts of history, and I think to me it's always interesting to read these types of accounts.
Another title on Hamza's reading list shares similar themes with Crooked Seeds. Written more than 30 years before and set on the other side of the world in troubled times, Carl, by Bernard McCleverty, explores the experiences of a teenager caught up in war and love.
Then the next book that I had was Carl, which was actually gifted to me by Karen Jennings when I was in Cape Town. Carl was written by Bernard McCleverty. And very similar to Crooked Seeds is this also short book. I mean, I call it short because I'm used to reading 700-page books. But it's enough for you to sort of learn about this also one person who, I think, almost in a different way, we start to see, this is your regular young person, who finds a girl and he's interested in her. He maybe gets a bit creepily sort of invested in that kind of relationship, and he sort of, so he gets a job or he gets near her, and sort of, they develop that kind of relationship. But as the pages take you into this journey, you also discover that, one, he's a victim of so much violence. So this is, I think it takes place in the 70s. And then, so, the time of IRA and some of those political instability in Ireland. But he gets involved also in the resistance movement. And then you find out that he did some terrible thing. And I think, he's also a victim of that sin, and he lives with the sin. And in a way, he can't allow himself to be happy. And so, same thing. You struggle. Are you going to root for this character? Is an antagonist? Is protagonist? Is a good person? And they tell you this thing about antagonists and protagonists being two faces of the same coin. In a way that they're both victims of their community. They were both sort of there was pain that was inflicted on this protagonist or antagonist, but the difference is how they react to that. So your good person, the protagonist, will take that as a learning experience and take it as a mission not to hurt other people and to prevent other people from being hurt the same way. But your antagonist is the opposite. They're hurt by society and they would inflict pain on others. And these characters, Deidre and Carl, they're neither here nor there. So they're not your typical sort of antagonist who goes and torments other people, but they're not also a protagonist, a hero you root for. They're human beings like all of us. They do good things and they do terrible things, and they live with their sins. And so I really enjoyed reading Carl.
It struck me that Deirdre and Carl were both wounded survivors, victims in need of help.
Yeah, and she's a victim of a traumatizing, or maybe a series of traumatizing events, in a way that she lost her leg at one point, and she discovers some terrible truths about her family and her history, and so I think she's never really moved on from that, and she still suffers those consequences, and you see that she almost sort of doesn't want herself to be, she doesn't want to be happy, so she doesn't let herself be happy and almost wants to ruin her own happiness in a way. Same thing with Carl. I think, when he sees things working out, I think he can't live with the sin that, of the terrible thing that he did, which I'm not going to spoil. But he lives almost in this loop where he recreates some of these traumas, because I feel like he can't forgive himself as well. So both of them are victims in a way, victims of themselves, victims of society, victims of those traumatic experiences, and they live, so they're outcasts to some level, but that's also the result of their own doing. They sort of put themselves away from society.
And I found it interesting that next on Hamza's list was a non-fiction title, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, dealing with how trauma affects the human brain and body.
Yeah, and that to me was fascinating and captivating in so many ways. And because, this is written from a scientific point of view, it sort of lists all of these research studies that were done in the field of trauma and sort of psychology, and the impact of trauma on sort of the human brain, on the body, and sort of how it impacts your life in the long term. But the book has this series. I think every chapter begins with some heart-wrenching account of, a case where somebody was a victim of some kind of trauma, but in a lot of these cases, people don't even know that, and it takes them a minute to even sort of unpack their traumas, and sometimes they even forget some terrible experiences that they lived as children or earlier in their life, until something happens. And it's that perspective of, if you don't deal with your traumas and you don't sort of work through them, maybe they will be hidden, or sort of maybe sort of you hide them away, but there would be a time when they emerge and they come back, and they cause obstacles. They prevent you from engaging, either at a personal level or at work, and that you can't control it because it can happen when you least expect it. And so the book sort of has all of these accounts, and then of course it has some of these methods of people, how they deal with their traumas. But to me, it was eye-opening in terms of sort of how the body reacts to it and how you can hide it, but then it comes out at one point. And through the books of Carl and Crooked Seeds, you could almost see that, I think, through the characters, of how, through time, they impact their experiences, they impact their past, and it turns out that they've gone through these traumatic experiences, and you wonder whether that's the reason they can't let themselves be happy, and they're almost destroying their own happiness, they're destroying their own lives in a way, because they can't, they're living with these sins, and they're living with these traumas that they haven't had the chance to work out quite well.
Was there advice for Deirdre and Carl somewhere in there? Could the body offer help to these fictional characters that somehow drew on reality?
Oh, okay. I have a friend with a psychological background, and she always tells you should not be handing out therapy like that. Yeah, I think, so the book actually has quite a lot of, towards the end, they have a lot of these sort of therapeutical sort of practices that have worked for some people. And then, of course, I think, it's always with the warning and the caution that, you should always seek professional advice. One of the memorable things were some of these role plays. So, I think there was this kind of workshop style place where the leaders or the facilitator would recreate some images, right? So like if you were abandoned by a parent as a kid, then sort of like they put you in these situations where you reimagine. So they put somebody who sort of plays the role of your parent. They turn away from you, or you tell them how to sort of to stand or to sit, and then you reimagine these conversations. I think we're all sort of like have these imagined conversations that we have with after a fight or with people. That these conversations we never have to have in real life. So I think this gives you a chance to recreate those conversations, to tell the parent who sort of who died or who passed away what you could never tell them. And then there's these sort of like cues where people move around the space in a way to allow you to relive that emotion. And then there is a healing part of it. And I think at one point you can either hug the person, or you can I think you're in complete control of the situation, and that that has sort of proven to be useful in a lot of situations. I wonder if maybe Didri could do that. I think she has a lot of unsolved problems with her brother, with her mother, who always says her brother. She learns a lot about her dad and his past, and so I wonder if she could benefit from a therapeutic sort of class where she goes and reimagines these people and tells them what she was never able to tell her family members.
Historical fiction, socio-political intrigue, mystery and identity. To round off the medley, we finish with a pinch of magical realism, Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. It started life as a play in 2010 before being adapted into a novel in 2015. The novel has since been filmed in Japan, and there are talks to develop it into a TV series.
Yeah, Before the Coffee Gets Cold, and I have one here. But I mean, Before the Coffee Gets Cold, what I love about it is, yes, it has that kind of like time and space travel, because it brings a story from Japan, and that's also part of the world that I'm not super familiar with, and so it brings in its own culture, it brings sort of its own people and characters, but it's also fascinating because it actually is a story about this little cafe where you can go and sit, and there is something magical going on there where you can go back and travel in time, but with very specific and strict conditions. Like you can't get up from your seat. You can only meet people who have been to that cafe at that specific time. So you have to really plan and time it quite right. You can only sit there for as long as the coffee is warm, because the minute it gets cold, you get stuck there. There is another rule where you can't change anything about the past or the future. And so, there's these strict rules, but people still take the chance and still go back. And it's always like second chances. And then the result is these fascinating accounts of these super humane stories of this, somebody who wants to go back and see his mom who had just passed away, or a wife, somebody goes back to see his partner, sort of like a business partner and like an old friend, and each of those will come back with the whole baggage of stories, right? And these people who want to amend, sort of who make amends and sort of not necessarily change the past, but like almost like feel better about themselves. And each of those ends up in discoveries and emotional experiences that change the person. Like, it ends up changing them by learning something, or sometimes they find out the truth about that person they're going to see. And the result is always this emotional journey that you go on. And I absolutely love that. And the way they're done is, you have your sort of, the characters who work at the cafe, and so you always see them. And there is a subtle story developing very slowly but subtly, and it makes them sort of realistic. But every story, it feels like a short story because it focuses on a different character and the life and sort of like how it's impacted by this journey. But then throughout the book, you see the waitress and the owner of the cafe, and I think there's a child too, and their lives also sort of like develop slowly, and it's very beautifully written, honestly.
And lastly, it's been a couple of years since Sand Roses came out, with Hamza busy working on the sequel, yes, in addition to all the book tours, panels, interviews and so on. So I asked him, how was he getting on with it?
It's in a good place. I've been able to write so much. Don't tell him, but I think it's now over 80,000 words. But in my lingua, that's probably half the book. No, I think it's like the last third of the book. So I'm getting sort of to that sort of towards the end, which is a good place to be. It just means it's going to be a huge book as usual, but I need to go back and, chop it off a little bit and add some more stuff. It needs some work, but, maybe a few more months to finish it. It's at least in that place where I'm not needing to stop for research every other day. And, I can write chapters because I think I've done enough research, and I've developed my world enough. It's always harder at the beginning. You have to stop and say, wait, did they have electricity? What was, literally I have to start, what was the bus line like? Was this building built at that time? Because you don't want to end up with the BlackBerry in the 1950s. No, but it's also exciting because also one thing I've been playing around with is, how people use different methods of, for entertainment, for correspondence, and, how the radio had a big place in the 1950s, and that's how people got entertainment, the news and everything. And then so they would huddle around the sort of the radio. So that was important. But then too, having a pen friend, and so I'm trying to experiment with that. And so, having a character write to this pen friend, and that's also a vehicle for her to discuss some of the themes that she struggles with, and maybe some of the topics that she's not comfortable talking to, to her family or her friends about. So she can sort of, even if she doesn't end up, there is this thing where sometimes she writes, but maybe she doesn't even end up sending these letters. And we never know, maybe none of this will end up, making it into the final cut. But I think it helps me to discover the character a little bit and how she thinks. Yes. And, yeah.